Hey, hello everybody, how's it going today? And welcome to the first episode of the Kagurabachi chapter reviews. This is going to be a new series starting here on the channel where, like other manga series like Ocean no Cold World Trigger that I've covered here on the channel in the past, I'm still covering them, it's not quite in the past yet, but today I want to start off with a new series of Kagurabachi. This has been a series that I've been reading in Jump since day one, and while I didn't really enjoy the series 100% in the beginning, by this point I've really warmed up to it to the point where when I read last week's chapter, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to do videos on this series, and I didn't end up making one for those because this is, as we will get to, this is chapter number 44 of Kagurabachi, titled The Curtain Falls. This is sort of the last arc, or last chapter of the Rakuzachi storehouse auction house arc. So yeah, bear with me here. Like I said, this is the first review of this series that I will be doing, so it'll take time for me to fully remember every character's name, and I did do a complete series reread before I even attempted doing this, just so I could fully remember everything and all of the context. And but yeah, being this is a new series I'm covering, it's going to be a little bit of a different change of pace, being that I have not really fully covered battle manga in the style I like to now. Of course, back in the day I covered My Hero, but I ended like during the big fight between Shigaraki and Deku, were the first big fight. So yeah, with that, I'd say let's just go and hop right into the chapter here. First, we start off with a color page this week, which is really cool since Kagurabachi has had 2 color pages in a row here. So this is a very interesting color page because it sort of says like Kagurabachi on the the top left-hand side of it. And we then just have sort of the characters. We have 3 characters on here, and their faces are sort of enclosed in kanji. Now, I don't know if this is the kanji for like directly at characters, because the characters on here is Mr. Shiba, Chihiro, and Haruki, and I don't know if this is the kanji of their name, or if this is the kanji that spells out Kagurabachi, or whatever is it, because of course, Kagurabachi in Japan is just, in English, it's just Kagurabachi, so there's no, it's not in English, but it is, katakana, so it pretty much translates evenly to Kagurabachi, so don't really quite know what's up with this, but it's a really cool color page, and I really love how we've got the image of Akari here with the storehouse Iso mask on, so really, really cool, all things considered, right? But we enter up this chapter where we left off last time with Kiora dying on the pedestal of the Rakuzachi auction, right? And he's sort of leaning there, he's covered in blood, and the Shinichi Enchanted Blade is there by his side, right? And Chihiro is there sort of looking at all of this happens, right? As all of a sudden we see all of the members of the underworld and everybody who is coming there to experience the auction. All of these mobsters are like, oh, or no, what are they called in Japan? Yakuza members. I don't know why I couldn't think of that term, right? But they're like, oh no, hey, what happened? Like, oh no, he's dead. Like, Kiora Sazanami is dead. Like, oh my gosh, what's going on here, right? And we get a very interesting look at Haruki's face. Of course, he just transferred all of the people out of Kyora's personal storehouse, and he just had to deal with all of that. So, like, we see that he's just bleeding, and of course, his father has just died in front of him, and that's a big moment for the kid, right? Well, of course, Shiba is behind him, and he sees all of this as all of the members of the Yakuza are sort of running out of the house, like, oh no, so Kyora's dead, and Chihiro Rokuhara is here, like, what are we supposed to do, right? And we see that Shiba sort of goes down and looks at Haruki, as all of a sudden, the entire building behind him starts to collapse. As Shiba sort of hears this, and we sort of see in the background just a bunch of stuff collapsing, and pretty much the entire place just going to shit, right? And at this point, we see that the 2 Kabunagi, or Kabunagi, however you say it, the 2 people who were there to bid on the Shinichi, legally pretty much, the 2 of them are sort of there. I don't think these 2 characters are even named, right? But we see the female is just like, hey, what was that sound, right? And we see that the guy's just like, well, it's as if the Shinichi and the aftermath from the shockwaves weren't chaotic enough. He's like, Hyuki's also on a rampage that's going to cause a massive amount of damage, right? And the lady's just like, hey, all right, that's a good thing we got out of there whenever we did, right? And she's like, hey, man, even the front entrance looks really bad too. as we pretty much see that just the entire storehouse and this entire place is just crumbling in the wake of having this enchanted blade battle go on within it. And of course, we had Hyuki doing all of her stuff too, right? And everyone's like, oh no, the place is collapsing, right? And Shiba's like, oh crap, like what's going on here? As he's just looking around, and there's a Yakuza guy behind him who's like, hey, well if this place is collapsing, but it doesn't matter. On the podium, the enchanted blade is sitting there, right? Like, it could be ours. And some other people are like, hey, but don't go out there, like, you don't want to die, like, yada, yada, yada. But all these people are sort of running towards the enchanted blade as Chihiro sort of turns around. Of course, he's very tired, and he just sees all these people, and we see that he's not really in a state of mind to do any more fighting after everything that he had done last chapter, as Mr. Shiba sort of runs up. Apparently, he grabs Haruki in this short interval of time, and Haruki sort of like got his arms wrapped around Shiba's neck, and Shiba goes to grab Chihiro to start teleporting him out. And as Chihiro says this, he looks over and sees the Shinichi right next to Kiora, and he just remembers and has that flashback of all of the chaos that Kiora wrought with it, just thinking about what could happen to the world if the Shinichi got out again. And he goes over and he reaches for it, and as he grabs it, we see that Shiba teleports them all outside, right? As all of these Yakuza members sort of look over, and right next to Kiora, the enchanted blade is no longer there. They're like, damn it, the blade's gone, like what are we going to do now? As the building fully collapses and kills everybody inside of it, right? So at this point, Chiba teleports outside, right? He's like, damn, that was close. And he's like, right, Chihiro? And he looks over, and Chihiro actually isn't there, right? And Chiba's like, crap, but I was just holding him. So what actually happened? As we see what actually did happen to Chihiro, as we see that he is now in a different place, and this is none other than, what is his name? I literally just looked it up before we got on here, and I think they even say it in this chapter, but let me quickly find it. Tafuku. They're in his sumo wrestling ring, as we see that Hyuki's here, and she has her foot on top of the Shinichi enchanted blade, right? And Chihiro looks up at this, right? And he just sees Hyuki there, right? And Hyuki's like, oh, so I guess the enchanted blade is safe to touch now. But she's like, hey, I told you, I am taking both of those enchanted blades. Like, you do not have a choice in this, right? And we see that Chihiro finally puts together what's actually happened, and he's just like, okay, so that's right. So just as Mr. Shiba was getting ready to transport us, Tafuku wished me away into this alternate space, as we see he is sort of sitting on bleachers, and it really looks like the same exact room where the storehouse just was. I don't think we exactly know like how Tafuku's space is created. We don't know if it's like the room around him and he sort of just imitates an area of it. Of course, we know the rules for getting out of this is having somebody pass out and winning a battle by all means, but Chihiro sort of realizes this, and he looks up, and Hyuki's there, and she's just like, oh, I'm sorry, right? And as all of this sort of just happens, we sort of cut away again to where Mr. Shiba is, and he's out there with Hikari, and the two of them are sort of just sitting there, and Mr. Shiba's like, all right, crap, I need to go back, I need to save Chihiro, like, we need to get this taken care of. And who's his face? Hyuki's just like, hey, not Hyuki, Haruki. He's there, and he's like, hey, wait. And he's like, no, just take a look up there, right? And he, and Mr. Shiba and Haruki look towards the building, and as all of the rumble is like still collapsing and everything, we suddenly see a large spike of fire just sort of come out of the building, just like engulfing a big portion of it in flames. As we see that 3 people end up walking out of the smoke, and it's of course Hyuki, Tafuku, and on Tafuku's shoulders is Chihiro. And they're there, and Shiba sees this, and as he sort of run up, Chihiro's like, hey, Tafuku, can you put me down? And Tafuku's like, yeah, sounds good. And he lets him down on the ground. Chihiro is not in good mental standing right now, as he almost falls over after just simply putting a foot on the ground. And as all of this happens, Hyuki's like, all right, hey, I'm going ahead. And we see the inside of her hand is none other than the Shinichi Enchanted Blade wrapped up in some fabric of some kind, right? And Shiba sees this and he's like, hey, where are you going? Like, the Shinuchi, like, where do you think you're going with that, right? And Hyuki sort of turns back around to Shiba and says, like, hey, I made an offer and he took it. And Shiba's like, wait, you made a deal? And he turns back around to see where Chihiro is sort of laying on the ground, and Chihiro gives a slight nod to Shiba, and Shiba's like, oh, okay. So after Shiba gets this nod from Chihiro, he's like, oh, okay. And that is sort of where we leave off, where Hyuki and Tafuku go for now, and sort of where Shiba goes, as we see that Hikari is sitting right next to Chihiro on these front steps overlooking the Rakuzachi storehouse and where all of it happened before. And Haruki's like, hey, what did you talk about in there, right? And Chihiro's like, well, we talked about what happens next. And Chihiro's like, so what are you gonna do, right? And Haruki's just like, well, after this, well, Mr. Shiba told me to not worry about my family, as we cut inside back to earlier whenever Tenri had done his whole thing using the Datenseki to give him spiritual extra powers pretty much. And we see that those two other members of the Toe that were around, not Haruki's one brother who's, I forget their name now, but let me look it up real quick. Sora, yeah. We don't quite know what he's up to, but of course we know that Tenri has been killed by the Datenseki, and then the two other unnamed Toe members who are also there. We see the one beefier dude's just like, hey, go and kill me right now. And he's like, hey, if I survive, I could never face Tenri or any of these other people. And before he can actually finish what his whole point is, Shiba's like, hey, no, just go home. Like, you still have little ones running around, right? And he's like, I'm not going to criticize Tenri's way of life, but we don't want the younger ones heading down that path. And Shiba's like, hey, go home. If you can set them straight, Tenri won't have died in vain. So we pretty much see that, yeah, Shiba ended up sparing these other two members of the Toe. Presumably these are just like sort of related and they're part of the Sazanami family. I mean, we know that they are not directly brothers of or sons of Kiora, because that wouldn't really make sense, because they would probably been eating around a dinner table with Tenri, Sora, Kiora, their mother, and of course Haruki there. So presumably that, but that's really all we get with these members here, right? But in the present, Haruki just continues like, hey, anyway, it's not like I can particularly go home. And he's like, I'm the Sazanami clan's enemy. And he's like, my father, and we suddenly cut inside to the minute before the entire place collapsed. And we just see the brief image of Kiora still kneeling on the pedestal where the auction was happening. And we see the top of the building just come and get ready to crush him, right? But we just see that Haruki continues outside just saying like, hey, no matter how warped he was, my father was always my North Star. And he's like, I don't know what to do now. And he's like, and before he can finish any of this, we see that Chihiro has a moment of looking over towards Haruki, and he thinks about whenever his father got killed also. I guess both of these two characters have dead dads now, so sort of that's what it is. It's going to be really funny whenever we sort of, because presumably like our main cast, like I'm sure Char still has plenty more to do. She just didn't have anything really in this arc. Of course we know her mother is dead, but we know that her father sold Char off somewhere, so Char's dad is probably alive. And like, what about Hinao's parents? Like, what's going on there? I don't remember if we learned anything about that. But Chihiro pretty much thinks about his father in the second of like, he didn't know what to do besides get revenge whenever his father was killed, right? But as all of this is happening, and Haruki's just like I don't know what to do now, and he says like, but before we can finish this, we hear in the background that the little kid, I forget what they called him, but the little kid who was coming to bust up the auction to save his sister, we see that his sister's there, as he's just like, oh, big sis, as she yells out, you're safe, and they give each other a nice big embrace and hug. And seeing this, Chihiro says, hey, Haruki, you saved them, right? And Haruki just looks inside of this, and he thinks of the woman whose skin was ice, who he talked to inside of the prison before, and he just remembers her words of, even outside of the cage, there is no hope. And he sees this hope happening right now of where Yu is reunited with his sister here, and he just thinks about all of these moments, and he starts to cry a little bit, right? As he eventually just looks over to Chihiro and just says, like, hey, Chihiro, will you let me keep fighting with you? And he's like, I want to keep proving the value that you saw in me, right? And at this point, we get a little bit of narration here, just saying, like, hey, for over 2 centuries, countless lives were assigned prices, and those people's hope was stolen by the Rakuzachi, the stew that stirred the passion of vile lowlifes. Finally, after all of these years, right here and now, the curtain falls as we get a massive 2-page spread of the entire cityscape here where the storehouse was before, and we see that the auction house has been completely leveled on the ground. Where once stood a brilliant auction house is now nothing but rubble on the ground, and we just see the image of Haruki and Chihiro sitting in front of the big building looking at it. We see Shiba sort of standing a little bit behind them, and then we see that Tafuku and Hyuki, of course with the Shinichi Enchanted Blade, are walking away from this massive disaster, right? So as all of this happens, we pretty much just hear, I think either Shiba or Haruki just says, like, hey, so what comes next? So at this point, we cut back into a flashback where, of course, this was inside of Tafuku's space before, where Hyuki had her foot on the Shinichi on the ground and pretty much said, like, hey, I'm taking both of these enchanted blades with me. And we pretty much cut back into this scene where Chihiro's, of course, still sort of laying, like, on the ground pretty much, and he's got his hand on the Shinichi, and he's like, directly to what Hyuki said earlier, he's like, hey, I didn't want to let anyone else possess these enchanted blades, right? And Hyuki's like, oh, so what do you want to do, fight about it? But Chihiro eventually says, like, hey, but the circumstances have actually changed. As he's like, today for the first time, I glimpsed a fraction of the Shinichi's powers, and I realized that they are far more intense than I ever imagined. And he's like, it's truly horrifying, as he thinks back on whenever, of course, his dad was still alive, and he's like, my dad barely even spoke of the Shinichi. Maybe did he really want to hide that power? As he sort of thinks about this, and Cheers is like, hey, I don't know how this blade works or when it could go off like that again, but I cannot let the Shinichi be loose. And we think back again to whenever we got a little bit of a lore detail that the Kabunagi, like the top 3 Kabunagi people, created the seal on the Shinichi blade that who's his face that the leader of the Hishaku ended up breaking in just under 3 years. So he pretty much thinks about this, and he says, like, hey, he's like, I don't have an ability to create a seal like that. And Hyuki's like, all right, then let the Kabunagi. But Cheer's like, hey, but the risks are way too great if I just hand the blade over. So he's like, you saw what happened at the Rakuzachi. The Hishaku were there, and one of them told me that their goal was to use the Shinichi, right? And he's like, I think they expected the Kabunagi to try to buy it, but still they submitted it to the auction. Don't you get it? And he's like, I know the Kabunagi are the ones who can seal the way. The Hishaku wanted them to get a hold of it. And he says, once the Kabunagi have it, the Hishaku will be able to make their next move. And Hyuki's like, all right then, so what? To seal it again, the Kabunagi need to have it, right? And she's like, hey, as for what we'll do, we'll drive them out into the open and stop all of those evildoers, right? And as she says this, she's like, right, you're completely correct. And she's like, wait, you're agreeing with me? But Shiro's like, hey, we can't let the enchanted blades be used for evil. Our objective is the same. And Chihiro reaches out onto the ground and picks up the enchanted blade and then sort of shoves it towards Hyuki and says, hey, here, take the Shinichi, right? And he's like, but hey, here's the thing. I'm not willing to just step away. And he says, When the Kabunagi have the Inten under their jurisdiction, your mission will be complete, correct? And he's like, well, there's one solution that works for us both. And Yuki's like, all right, what are you getting at here? As all of a sudden, Chihiro thinks back to a lot of things his father said, like, hey, and he just thinks on all of this, and he says, like, hey, I need to know what my father was holding back with these blades. The deeper I dig into this, the more I can learn. As he pretty much, for the final panel of the chapter, he says, hey, let me join the Kabunagi. And that is where we end off this chapter of Kagurabachi this week. This is an insanely awesome chapter, and one that I was a little surprised of whenever I first read it, because I'm like, really, he's joining the Kabunagi? But the more I've thought about it, the more it really makes sense, because, I mean, in a bunch of typical battle shonen, there's that whole idea of, okay, you have this power system, and you have the main character use the power system for some time, and of course in the series it's sorcery, and at this point they have a member who was once part of a organization that then they just join. I'm mainly talking about you, Bleach, with the whole Soul Society, Kisuke or Urahara stuff, and here it's sort of the same exact thing. And with Chihiro joining the Kabunagi, it really just seems like the next logical jump in the sort of the bridge or whatever, and the storytelling narrative. So it really does make a lot of sense. Again, I'm sorry if this video sort of came out a little weird. Like I said, this is my first time recapping Kagurabachi, so I'm not quite used to all of the names and actually pronouncing all of these Japanese terms out loud. If there's one thing I do want to bring up about this chapter, it does look like the art style is getting a little rough in some places. I mean, the color page looks really nice, but whenever we get into like page 4, whenever Shiba is drawn on the page, and whenever Chihiro is drawn in the bottom left corner of this page, they look sort of a little off, and then the characters look really off whenever you go towards the page number 12, and you see Haruki and Chihiro sitting on the ground. They look very sort of muddled in a way, so not really something that I've seen before, and they do definitely look different. But also then the art of the city as we get that page of the curtain falls looks really, really beautiful, and it does look really nice seeing all of the party sort of walking away from the area. And yeah, I'm excited to see what happens in the future. Of course, Chihiro is now part of the Kabunagi, so that's a little interesting and pretty cool. So, well, he's not part of it yet. I would honestly hate if we go into like a new arc of, oh, hey, here is, here's the Kabunagi joining test, here you go, and we got like 10 chapters of that. But I don't think the series is going to necessarily go there. Maybe like a 2-chapter thing where Yuki has to like vouch for Chihiro to get in and be able to have the Inten, and because I can also see a world where they seal up Chihiro, sort of like the other sword masters, because of course we know that just Shinichi sword master was a big part of this last arc, but there's a million and one ways that Kagurabachi could go from here. I'm not in the field of predicting every little which way the story could go, but yeah, this was a really fun chapter, and yeah, thank you guys for watching. I do a lot of other manga and anime related videos on the channel, so go check out those if you would sort of feel like it. I don't necessarily have any Kagurabachi reviews up yet, but it won't be too long until I got a few more, so yeah. Thank you guys so very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments how I can improve on my Kagurabachi videos, and yeah, I'll see you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.